term, and an NGO even had an advertising campaign calling those laws that were supposed to protect protected areas paper tigers. They, it was nicely done, but the message that they wanted to convey was that, look, those parks are established, we have laws, but if we don't have rangers and if we don't have response for violations, those parks are protected only theoretically on paper, not in real life. So the whole purpose of what that INES does, and we are, and I mean we, because I feel in a very comfortable position, because I am both at the Commission of Environmental Law and with INES, but is to cross-contaminate the two organizations. And I can assure you that the result, the baby will not be a monster. It's something very positive, although the organizations are so different. IUCN can contaminate and has contaminated INES because at its origin, and I was, started with INES before Ken arrived, so almost 20 years now. INES was a pollution control organization, paying very little attention to conservation, to the protection of nature. So that's the impact that IUCN can have and has had in INES. And now, if you look at the strategic plan, if you look at the guiding principles of INES, is half and a half, because we cannot protect the air, the water, the soil without protecting nature, and vice versa. So this is very clear, and we have the two communities that in many countries are separated for historical reasons, including in my country and the United States, to list just two of them. Well, that said, compliance and enforcement is done by people. And this means that we need to have actors that do compliance and enforcement. And when we say compliance and enforcement, it's not just criminal. So perhaps we misnamed this workshop. Instead of saying just public prosecutors, because it conveys a criminal dimension. But public prosecutors in many countries, including my own, do both civil and criminal prosecutions. In other words, they have standing to bring a criminal prosecution, put people behind bars for committing environmental crimes, but also have standing to file a civil suit for damage or for restoration of an ecosystem that has been impaired or contaminated, or an area that has been illegally cleared. So when we say compliance and enforcement, and Ken has a wonderful presentation that he's going to give in a minute or so, we mean the whole picture, including one, civil and criminal, but also including judicial and administrative, and including public and private compliance and enforcement. So what Manolo, Gustavo Alanis, and other colleagues here do when they bring a lawsuit, they are doing compliance and enforcement. They are working as what we call in English, we don't have a term in Portuguese or perhaps in Spanish, but not in Portuguese or French, the private attorney general. It's society itself that is opening the doors of the judiciary system, and if the attorney general is not doing his or her job, you have organized civil society making sure that the enforcement or the compliance and enforcement gap is closed. So this is a crucial collaboration for IUCN. I see Marcos nodding. He comes from a treaty that is one of the most convention, that is one of the most effective conventions in the world. In fact, there is nobody taking. There are only two conventions that are really effective. One is CITES, and the other one is the Montreal Protocol for substances that deplete the ozone layer. The other ones are still struggling because exactly they don't have compliance and enforcement mechanism. If you look at RAMSA, the Biodiversity Convention, and others, they do lack this, those teeth that we find in science. And that's what takes me to my final comment. I said that compliance and enforcement is very broad, includes all those different avenues that I mentioned, but there is one that's probably the most difficult avenue that we need to explore is international compliance and enforcement. And here, except for if you commit such an outrageous crime that you are taken to the wrong international criminal tribunal or court, except for that, we have no mechanism for really doing compliance and enforcement the way we see it at the international level. Of course, Nlufa is the expert on international law here, and she can complement what I'm saying. So the only avenue that is really visible at the moment is to do map working of domestic compliance and enforcement agencies and actors. In other words, you have an international treaty. It could theoretically have a forum where it would be implemented, but they don't. So you use the network of compliance and enforcement that exists in different countries, but in order to do that, you have to put them together in collaboration. And that's not easy, but it is doable, as, for example, CITES is doing, and the Montreal Protocol. So those are my initial comments, just to trigger the discussion, and I'm sure that Ken and the other speakers and all of you will have much more to say. At some point I have to leave because I have another workshop on conflicts that I need to attend. But I intend to stay for most part of this debate.
Thank you, Antonio. Does anyone have questions for Antonio before we proceed? I thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of background, and I had prepared a presentation to try to set the stage for compliance and enforcement. So if you permit me, as Justice Benjamin stated before, it's been 40 years since we've really been making environmental law at all levels, at the international level, at national levels, at local levels. Many counts, there's over 1,000 treaties that have environmental provisions, and most, if not all, countries around the world have adopted national environmental legislation. But we got a problem. If anyone read the most recent UNEP GEO5 report, we're seeing continued extinction of species and biodiversity loss. The world is warming. Huge desertification. In our own country this summer, 80% of the United States has been under severe drought. Crops are dying, and that's just one little piece of the world, but other parts of the world we're seeing expanding deserts, we're seeing loss of forests, we're seeing cities continuing to be degraded by air pollution, water pollution. I think the statistics, I had some statistics now, that 80% of the world does not have access. Right now, 80% of the world's population live in areas with high level threat to water security. You have a number of eutrophic coastal zones right now that have increased dramatically over the last 20 years. Up to 2/3 of the species in some taxa are threatened by extinction. This is since 1970, when these laws were first being created, we're seeing the vertebrate population decrease by 30% globally. So we have these laws. They're designed to protect our environment, all aspects of the environment, but it's not working. Law isn't good enough. It's what we come to know as the compliance gap. We have a compliance gap with international obligations. Countries sign on to treaties and do nothing to implement those treaties and to nationalize them. We see domestic legislation proliferated, but the firms, individuals are not meeting their obligations. It's creating a problem. We're not meeting the underlying objectives of all of those laws. We call this a compliance gap. Without compliance, societies cannot meet their sustainable development objectives. You just have words on paper. So how do we improve? How do we move the ball forward? We wanted to set up the arrangement. We set up these goals. You can call it sustainable development. You can call it environmental protection. You can, pick your names for the top of the pyramid. But we set these goals. To reach those goals, you need to establish a system of implementation and governance. That involves law. It's the best shot we have. It's our best guess. It's how we're going to try to meet those objectives. But if we don't have compliance with those laws, all we have, as I started the presentation today, is just words on paper. Enforcement is one of the mechanisms to get to better compliance. It's not the only way to get there, but it is certainly a key component. And stop me if you have any questions along the way. But we have a big challenge here right now. You have lack of capacity. You may have the greatest law in the world, but if you don't have the staff, the resources to uncover violations, it's impossible to enforce. It's not easy to collect evidence, to bring a case, to come up with a solution. You don't even have awareness in many countries that environmental laws exist. There's a lack of knowledge that we see globally right now. This is indicative in the most consumptive countries, as my friend Tony Oposa says, and the least consumptive countries. It's not really just, it's not only a developing country issue. It is an issue that is all over the world right now. There's not awareness or priorities of judges, of prosecutors, of the police to go after environmental violations. There's other priorities, there's other economic development priorities, things that we're struggling with. There's also a lack of cooperation and communication that we see between the investigators, between the prosecutors, the agencies, all that have some type of responsibility for assuring compliance with the environmental laws. Data collection is very important. It helps you with priority setting. It helps you with bringing your cases. If you're a prosecutor, you need evidence, you need to collect data, you need to state your case. There's lack of good data, good monitoring. We see some laws may exist, but they don't have really teeth to those laws. There's not strong penalties or other types of relief that a court can prescribe under the law to change behavior towards compliance. And even if they do issue the penalties, sometimes those penalties aren't even enforced. You have someone mentioned EIA, an environmental impact assessment. This is a problem that INES is working on right now, that you have all this wonderful predictive modeling, you do all these studies, and it's compiled into this big book that sits on a shelf, and no one goes back and measures necessarily the performance against what that modeling had said. You don't have the proper permitting systems, the licensing, or the resources to go back and check. And then there's very poor coordination often between the international agreements that countries sign on to and national implementing legislation. Some, as Justice Benjamin mentioned, the Montreal Protocol, CITES, it's a little bit better. But others, it's just floating. And these are all reasons why, but not excuses, we can do better. To get compliance, we need to create an atmosphere of deterrence, that we know there's going to be some form of ramification, that if you violate the law, that is strong enough to try to deter that non-compliant behavior. So you need to have some type of credible likelihood that if you commit a crime, the person goes out, poaches an elephant, that violation will be detected. That if it is detected, that there's fear that there will be a swift response, that that poacher is going to be arrested, or some other form of response by the government. And that there's going to be a consequence that creates enough fear that they won't do this again. Sometimes it's a jail, sometimes it's a high fine, but there are many different ways, and we'll go back and talk about that. And then you need the perception that all three of these exist. And this is all just the basic criminal enforcement disincentive model. You know, there's a guy named Becker who came up with this basically, that says the probability of, this is how the criminal mind works. What's the likelihood that I'm going to be detected committing that heinous crime? If I am detected poaching that elephant, will I be arrested? If I'm arrested, will I be prosecuted? If I'm prosecuted, will I be convicted? If I'm convicted, will that conviction be enforced? And is that penalty at the end strong enough? And these factors all are multipliers. If any part of that chain is zero, there is lack of deterrence here. You know, so you put this probability model and you could wipe it all out by having a very low probability. We know that they've got great eyes and ears on the ground, but there's no prosecutors that are going to take that case. So what is the deterrence to prevent that crime from happening? We need to create an atmosphere of compliance. Not all actors are bad or the same motives. You have on the left end here, you have the worst of actors. Those that are going to find some kind of criminal motive. There's a profit margin. There's a market for elephant tusks and rhino horns, that they can get good dollar that is going to make them see an opportunity. At the other end, you may have someone who wants to comply but doesn't quite know that the laws apply to them. This is more in the pollution context maybe than in some of the species trade or illegal timber trade. But what we're trying to do is try to figure out the right buttons to push to change behavior to create compliance across that entire continuum. So maybe the person who just needs some better knowledge of law, you can do that with technical assistance or compliance assistance or other means of education. But that's not going to change the criminal on this end. We need to have strong, swift, severe penalties that will create a deterrent effect. And so all along this curve, we're trying to move towards a higher level of compliance. I see some faces that have some questions. Any? So, you know, there's many different tools that laws have. Some have criminal sanctions, some have administrative fines, some offer incentives. You've got to understand who the regulated community is and understand which buttons to push within the tools that you're given in your law to try to change that behavior towards a more compliant approach. INEAS, as Antonio was describing, is a global network primarily of environmental protection agencies, Fish and Wildlife Services, offices of attorney generals, and judges. The participants in the compliance chain primarily from the government. And this is what we do. We work to build capacity along the entire regulatory curve with the inspectors, are in charge of implementing the law, the prosecutors who bring the cases. But in often countries, this could be the police, or it could be the military, it could be others that have that enforcement authority. What we're doing is we're sharing instructional materials, best practices, developing training programs that are adaptable to individual national level systems. We bring together user groups from different jurisdictions to try to solve problems jointly. We find right now we had issues in the context of carbon markets. There was a lot of people that were developing carbon offset projects around the world, yet the enforcement to assure that a ton of carbon was really a ton of carbon, jurisdictions were struggling with it. So INES pulled together an expert group, and they started sharing best practices for monitoring, reporting, verification of different carbon projects. We exchange information. Our biggest channel to do that is through the INES website, which is a wealth of information. But we do it also with e-learning,